Welcome to Never Again Is Now, a podcast about anti Semitism. I am Evelyn Marcus.
And I am Phyllis Dimbler Miller.
The Jews in Australia have lived a peaceful life since their arrival in the mid 19th century. That changed drastically after October 7, 2023. We discussed this with Robert Gregory in Sydney, Australia. He's the CEO of the Australian Jewish Association, a Jewish community organization with a traditional Jewish and center-right political orientation. Robert, welcome to our podcast and thank you for coming on.
Thank you for having me on.
So, national political leaders in Australia call the current wave of anti-Semitism in the country a national crisis. Can you please tell our listeners how Jews have been targeted recently in Australia?
Well, your description was correct that Jews in Australia have lived a peaceful life since arrival, but it all changed after October 7, and Australia was one of the first places to change. We saw just hours or a day after October 7, we saw at the Sydney Opera House, scenes were broadcast around the world of a crowd of people shouting anti-Semitic slogans, and this was before Israel had even responded to October 7. So that's where it started, and then it spread. And in
Wait,
the
can I
beginning,
ask you what accounted for this within hours? Where did that come from?
well, I think anti-Semitism had been building up, and perhaps not everyone was aware of it and had realized it, and it was just waiting for a valve to be released, and that was it.
But Robert, let's go back to my question, your answer to my question. What happened? Well, how have Jews been targeted since October 7, so 2023? So you said at the Opera House, there were the next day or so, there were pro-Hamas demonstrations, correct?
Yeah, pro-Hamas demonstrations with all the usual, burning Israeli flags, but it was actually really bad because what happened is the government of the state where the Sydney Opera House is, so the New South Wales government, decided to light up the Opera House in blue and white, as many other landmarks around the world were lit up following October 7.
Mhm.
But the government began to realize that it wasn't gonna go well. So the police minister actually warned the Jewish community, stay at home for your own safety. Do not attend the Sydney Opera House because
Mm.
it's going to get violent. So while it was lit up, which was a nice gesture, the Jewish community was told to stay at home for their own safety. So it got off to a bad start. And then the chants, there's a bit of a dispute about the chants. Many people who attended heard "Gas the Jews" being chanted. The police later conducted inquiry and said actually it was "Where's the Jews?" Which is also not a great thing for a mob to be chanting, but there is some dispute about what was said. But following that, I mean, the scenes we saw across Australia were pretty similar to what we would have seen in many American cities. So we saw CBDs taken over by anti-Israel protests. We saw the protests spread to universities. We saw encampments set up, which were quite bad in Australia. Jewish students reported having to hide Magen David necklaces. Classes were disrupted. Activists were bursting in. The protests, we had them outside synagogues. So in both Sydney and Melbourne, synagogues were targeted for protests. But what happened in the last year or so is we started seeing actual attacks on buildings, which was very troubling. So we saw the torching of cars in neighborhoods where many Jews live, the vandalizing of the home, the former home of a Jewish leader. We saw a major synagogue in Melbourne burnt to the ground. And we even saw a daycare center for very young children burnt to the ground. So,
Really?
yeah, the Jewish community really started to get worried then. And we've just seen, I mean, it's just every day, lots of little incidents. So there was a very famous video that went around a few weeks ago of two nurses in a
Mhm.
hospital, yeah, saying they would refuse to treat Israeli or Jewish patients, and I mean the nurses actually said they would kill them. They had killed patients. I don't think they did, but they were claiming they had. These type of incidents make the Jewish community very worried. I mean, when you go to hospital, you're very vulnerable. You don't want to have to worry if the nurses and doctors will kill you.
Who would think this would happen in Australia? And these are, I mean, severe attacks on the Jewish community.
I would say more severe even than the United States.
Yeah.
When you look at burning a synagogue, burning a nursery school. So who are the perpetrators? Can we actually name them?
So it's a trifecta. It's the far left, the far right, and parts of the Islamic community. So, I mean, traditionally, the far right has always been anti-Semitic and has been a threat to the community, but it's quite small in Australia. It has been a bit emboldened lately. Maybe, it's quite active online, on X, on Twitter. We occasionally see, a small group of neo-Nazis will, you know, march outside a Jewish museum or something, or a CBD, but they're usually quite small, and the police usually know what's going on. They've infiltrated these groups, and they'll often be masked. I think the far left is a really big threat. It's grown a lot. They can get thousands of people to protests, and this is who's leading the actions on university campuses. And parts of the Muslim community. I mean, the two nurses that I mentioned before in this hospital were from the Muslim community. Australia has quite a large Lebanese community that came out after the civil war in Lebanon in the 1970s and 1980s. So it's much larger than the Jewish community, and a lot of the incidents are coming from parts of that community as well.
Wait, first I need a word definition. What does CBD stand for?
CBD is the Central Business District. So
Oh,
there's
okay. I kept thinking, shouldn't I know this? Okay, now back to a serious question. But why the left? Is it coming from abroad? Who's telling the left suddenly to hate Jews?
Well, it's interesting you mentioned coming from abroad because there's been some developments in recent days, and what's been happening with some of the attacks, what police believe, is that they're being carried out by like common criminals, like drug addicts and people released from prison. And the police were trying to understand how is it happening, because these people don't have a history of anti-Semitism, and they believe that it's some of these attacks are being directed from abroad through online apps and different computer programs that criminals are being paid money to carry out these attacks. So that's quite concerning, and they believe it might be linked to Middle Eastern organized crime gangs. We've seen similar things in other countries, I think in Europe as well, where criminal gangs are involved being paid. And in those countries, I believe it's linked to Iran. The police have not made the same links yet here. But why is the left turning like this? I think it's been building up for a while, particularly in university campuses with some of the lecturers. The same ideas that have spread in America about Israel being a colonial settler state, Jews being white oppressors, these sort of ideas are certainly prevalent in Australia. And I think now, I mean, we hadn't seen it really played out in attacks, but this is starting to happen.
So is there any link between the criminal organizations that are paid from abroad um, and the anti-Semitism at the left, or is that independent of each other?
I think the allegations from police are that it's independent. Um, the police are coming up with some theories that not everyone in the Jewish community accepts. So their theory, basically a one of the most severe incidents, a caravan, I think in America you call it an RV. I
Hmm.
don't know what that stands for there, but
Recreational vehicle.
recreational vehicle was found with 40 kilograms of explosives and the addresses of Jewish institutions. So this made everyone in the Jewish community very worried. Police found this, but they say that it wasn't actually anti-Semitic, and they believe these criminal gangs put it there and intended it to be found because they wanted to use it to negotiate lower sentences for some senior gang members for other um, crimes they're facing charges for. So, I mean, that was a strange theory. Their theory, they say that the gangs were always going to tip off the police about it. It was never intended to be used, and this is a negotiating tactic. So that was quite interesting. But I don't think the gangs, I mean, there may be some overlap. As I mentioned, a lot of the members are Middle Eastern gang members, so and the people have not been apprehended, so it's hard to know exactly their motive. Police are saying it's for to lower the sentences, but whether I don't know if we can rule out anti-Semitic sentences, anti-Semitic reasons, sorry, because it had a list of Jewish targets with these explosives. It had the Jewish Museum, the largest synagogue here in Sydney, the Great Synagogue. So it's a huge concern.
So when you say Middle Eastern gangs, what do you mean, terrorist organizations or organizations involved in drugs, crimes, and stuff like that?
The second one. So I guess we have organized motorcycle gangs here, and there's a lot of overlap. As I mentioned, we have a large Middle Eastern community in Australia. So there's the gangs are not. I think in America you have the Hells Angels and different groups, and they're but in Australia it's all quite connected with criminal gangs and certain communities. So there is a link there.
Mhm. What are the government and the Australian authorities doing against all these?
So in the beginning, the Jewish community was very critical of both the government and the police, especially after the Sydney Opera House incident, where the Jewish community was told to stay at home. And there was a real concern for many months that both the police and the government were not taking it seriously. I know myself personally, in my organization, we would receive many threats, death threats. We would report them to police, and no action was taken, or sometimes a warning would be given to different people. So there was a lot of concern. But following some of the more serious incidents that have happened over the last few months, so particularly the burning to the ground of that synagogue in Melbourne, the finding of the explosives, I think there's been a bit of a change in both the police and the government. There's now a bit of concern that Australia also has an election coming up within a few weeks. So I think there's a concern that if there is a major terrorist attack or some sort of incident with, God forbid, loss of life, that it would look terrible for the government. So a special strike force in the police, the federal police, has been set up, which is a welcome move. And we've had several meetings with them, and they do seem to be taking it more seriously. There has been now some arrests, but the government, it's still, well, it might start taking anti-Semitism a bit more seriously. It's become very anti-Israel even before October 7 and following October 7, one of the most hostile governments in the West towards Israel. So that is also stirring up trouble in Australia and the community. And I don't think there's any indication that there'll be a change in that from the government. I think they're quite set in their views on this.
Wait. Why would Australia be one of the most hostile? I just don't understand it.
Well, it's a big change for Australia because Australia's always been very supportive of Israel. From 1948, I mean, because of the alphabet, obviously Australia is one of the first countries at the United Nations to even vote for Israel, and it's always been a strong supporter. Often, in the 90s and the early 2000s, it would only be the United States and Australia and some tiny islands voting with Israel at the United Nations. But the current government, some of the people in leadership positions, including the Prime Minister, were anti-Israel activists in their youth. He used to attend pro-Palestinian rallies. And it also, the government relies on the vote from a very large Islamic community. So the Jewish community in Australia, according to the census, is just under 100,000 people. It's probably a bit higher. Not everyone puts their religion. It's probably closer to 150,000, but there's about 1 million Muslim people in Australia. So it's a very large voting bloc, which the government needs to appeal to. And then there's also Australia has a very far left political party called the Greens, which competes with the government. So the government needs to win over those votes there. So we saw even before October 7 that this government was elected in 2022, and we saw them change the UN votes. Then we saw the previous government before them had recognized Jerusalem as the capital of Israel, like the United States did. We saw them unrecognize that, which was a very strange move to make, and various other moves like that. And obviously following October 7, the government has not been supportive. They told Israel to show restraint as the attack was happening. The Australian Prime Minister has refused to visit Israel, even though he's been in the region, in the area, and people have suggested he should have visited. The Foreign Minister did visit Israel, but would not visit any of the sites of the attacks, the Nova Festival or the kibbutzes. So it's just been a very uncaring government in those ways.
Do you feel so your prime minister he has been as a student he was already very anti-Israel, pro-Palestinian. Um, you see this, we also see in America and in Europe the students of today will be the leaders of tomorrow, and they may be very anti-Israel because of the large anti-Israel movements, pro-Palestinian movements that are anti-Israel in universities, etc. Is that also where your prime minister has been formed in his ideas?
I would say so, yes.
Mhm.
But we're very concerned. We have the same trends that you do amongst the youth, amongst the universities. Particularly TikTok is a major concern that it's making the younger generations quite anti-Israel. I've visited a couple of the universities when they had these encampments, and all the students need to walk past, big anti-Israel tents and encampments. So in their formative years, this is what they're being exposed to. This is what they think is good advocacy. There's a lot of the student organizations, so not specific Palestinian student organizations, but just the National Union of Students, and they're very anti-Israel. The student leaders take part in these sort of protests. I was actually just speaking to the media yesterday about a story that student fees are being used to fund some of these protests in some universities. So this is what they're being exposed to, and it's a real concern.
Yeah.
I'm really interested in this concept of the fifth column. I know many of you don't remember the movie The Manchurian Candidate, but I in terms of immigration, how many foreign students a year are allowed to attend university? I don't expect you to know the numbers, but I just see what's happening right now at Columbia. I'm, it's just
Columbia University, you mean,
yes,
or
yes, thank you.
for the country? Yeah.
Yes. I see that these students are being sent with very specific agendas from abroad, getting green cards, marrying American citizens if they can, so that they have even stronger reason to stay here, and then leading these uh, anti-Israel, anti-Jewish attacks. And I just wonder what's going on with immigration in Australia. Is it still open borders?
So immigration's been a major issue here, because Australia doesn't have a huge population, but it's taking in very large. I mean, it has similar problems to many Western countries in that the birth rate is quite low, so it takes in a lot of immigrants. A lot of people want to come to Australia. I believe in the last year or so, about 600,000 immigrants. Compared Australia population is quite small, and the birth rate is only, I think 150 or 200,000 people a year. So it's quite large. And there's concerns that people are not being integrated properly, particularly the university sector. So universities are actually really big business for Australia. They bring in a lot of revenue because we take hundreds of thousands of foreign students. So there's a
Mm,
big lobby for the universities. They don't want any tampering with it. They want these
mm.
students to come in because they charge them a lot of fees. I think it is a big concern.
And do you feel that the the anti-Israel sentiment was fed by immigrant students?
I don't know if all of it was. I mean, you know, we have enough of our own homegrown anti-Israel activists on the university campuses. I think there's some people, that whether they're anarchists or communists or different, radical students that are fueling this. Certainly, some of the students from overseas also are. Recently, one university, the University of Sydney, disciplined a student from overseas for anti-Israel activism, for I think vandalizing or writing on the whiteboards like radical anti-Israel slogans. They disciplined them, and then when it came out that the student's visa could be at risk because of the disciplining, the university actually apologized for getting the student in trouble because it may have led to them being deported back to a country where they would be um, persecuted, back to an Islamic country. So I think that it certainly contributes. The university issue has been a big one in Australia. The opposition has been calling for a judicial inquiry, for an independent, for judges to examine what's going on. Government hasn't wanted to do that. There's big arguments over free speech, what should be allowed on universities, whether the encampments are a valid form of protest or whether Jewish students are being intimidated. So, I mean, it doesn't all come from foreign students, but some of them certainly contribute.
So, how does the Jewish community of Australia react to this? And what side is the media on?
So, following October 7, in those early months, there was a lot of fear. We would hear constant themes of people hiding their Star of David necklaces, as I mentioned, people taking off mezuzahs, getting very worried about different things, making sure to cover kippahs when they're walking around and just changing their plans. Obviously, security has been upped a lot at all Jewish institutions. The Jewish schools look like fortresses. But I think more recently there's been a lot of anger that the concerns of the community weren't being taken seriously, anger, as I mentioned, at the authorities over different incidents, disputes about, what happened at the Opera House, disputes about the reasons, the motivations behind some of these attacks. Um, so there was a big conference against anti-Semitism just a few weeks ago, which was held uh, jointly between the Jewish community and a big media outlet here, Sky News. And various people were invited from the government, from the state government, from the opposition, and different experts. And when the representative from the government came to speak, the Attorney General of Australia, who also happens to be Jewish, he was actually booed several times and heckled, which it's not something, this is
Wait,
a
wait.
official.
The Attorney General was booed?
The Attorney General was booed by the Jewish community. So I think that reflects the mood people are feeling because he got up and he was speaking about all the accomplishments of the government and how seriously they're taking it. And I think people felt that was not the case. So I haven't seen it. This wasn't some group of young activists. This was a major Jewish community event. I haven't seen that sort of behavior before. So I think that does reflect the mood of people. And then we see just individual moves. So there's been a big move away from some of the public schools towards Jewish day schools. Australia already has a very high rate of Jewish day school attendance, much higher than America. I think it's about like 50% or so. But there's been a lot of bullying in some of the public schools where Jewish students have been picked on. So there's been a big move towards Jewish schools. So we're seeing, yeah, these type of incidents from the Jewish community. Obviously, Aliyah is something that's been spoken about. I don't think it's reflected yet in the figures because this is, still quite recent, but a lot of people talk about how they're making plans, how they're, I've heard from quite a few people who purchase property in Israel or starting to plan whether they need an option to leave Australia in the next couple of years, particularly depending on the results of the next election here.
And what about the
Unbelievable.
media?
Who would have thought that? And we see that after October 7 in the whole Western world, Jews are targeted also at places where that wasn't the case so much before October 7. I'm pretty shocked by what you tell us. Phyllis.
Yeah, and here in the United States, many of the major newspapers have stopped being as objective as I was taught as a journalist to be. And and I'm talking major, I'm not talking the left wing or the right wing. And and it's fascinating even to read two different newspapers and see how they, in one paragraph, put a totally different slant into something in Israel, about Israel. So, what about the major media in Australia? Are they seeming to take sides? Or are they trying to be objective?
I don't know of any really objective media. I think there's a big split down the middle. So Australia has a public broadcaster, I think similar to the BBC, the British Broadcasting.
Which has become very unsympathetic to Israel and rather
Exactly.
pro-Hamas. But okay, keep going.
Yeah, so we have our equivalent of that. It's called the ABC, and that has been very anti-Israel. There's been a lot of criticism of that because it is funded by the taxpayers, over $1 billion a year. So that is quite anti-Israel. But we also have, I guess, the equivalent of the sort of right-wing media you have in America, of Fox News, and that is very pro-Israel. So they tend to report these incidents, whereas the public broadcaster, if they cover anti-Semitism, which is quite rare, they'll usually also want to talk about Islamophobia and different issues like that. So there's been a real split in the media, which is unfortunate because it should be non-biased and just reporting about it. But the media owned by News Corp, which is owned by Rupert Murdoch, who also owns Fox News in America,
And the Wall
they are
Street Journal.
and the Wall Street Journal. So they own in Australia some of the major newspapers as well as a TV station. So they've that was also the media outlet that put on this anti-Semitism conference that I mentioned. So they are really taking it as a serious issue. Rupert Murdoch actually visited the synagogue that was burned down with his wife when he was visiting Australia and pledged, I think something about $300,000 of his own money to rebuild it. So yeah, that is a sort of breath of fresh air in the media here, but otherwise it's quite hard to get coverage of anti-Semitism.
And Robert, how are the people in Australia reacting to October 7 and to the rise of anti-Semitism in Australia? Not the people in the government, but the people, just the general population.
So again, it's a bit of a mix. Following October 7 and following many of the anti-Semitic attacks, we would receive calls and emails from all across Australia of people expressing support for the Jewish community. It is a lot of Christian people who have been very supportive, as well as other minorities who have faced persecution before. So Hindus, and we have Iranian diaspora here who've been quite supportive. And a lot of people in rural areas, older Australians, just shocked. It's not the Australia they remember. But I think some Australians also have been quite concerned about, as the daycare was burned down and different things, they're getting more concerned from a law and order perspective that, the government and the authorities are losing control of the situation. So this concerns them as well. But then there's also on the other side, some fatigue setting in. So some people say, why do you keep speaking about anti-Semitism? Like, the Jewish community is tiny. It's not the biggest issue. Why is it on our news every night? There is a bit of fatigue setting in. Some people, even with what's going on, they still can't understand, why the Jewish community here because guns are quite rare in Australia. So why there's armed guards outside Jewish schools, they can't understand it. They blame Jews for what's going on. So there is a real mix amongst Australians, but we have been surprised by some of the support we've received from across the country, and it's always good to receive those messages and calls.
So, what well, first of all, can the current anti-Semitism in Australia be turned around, do you think? And how
So
can we help the rest of us help if it could be?
it's a good question. Some things, long-term trends are not positive, as we spoke about with the young people, the universities, TikTok. So even if we can turn it around for now, I don't know what direction we're heading in long term, but this is a bigger situation around the West. Um, I think as an Australian internal issue, if there's a change of government, which, as I said, the election is in a few weeks, the opposition is very supportive. So I think that would create a different atmosphere in Australia. So that would be a big help. But in terms of what can people around the world do, so what happened that was actually very helpful, a couple of months ago, the Simon Wiesenthal Centre released a travel warning for Australia about how dangerous it is. And that actually made the news here in Australia, and it was a big story. So the Australians and the Australian government do take account of what's happening overseas, of what people are saying. So I think as long as people are talking about this issue, as it's been mentioned, whether it's on social media or in the media overseas, I've done a few interviews, different overseas media, so it's a big issue. Um, it would be great. I think I don't know how anyone could make it happen, but I think if someone could get people in the current administration in America to comment on it, that would put pressure on Australia to start taking action if they knew that people in leadership positions in America or different countries were watching this closely and concerned about this. So if there was any way to do that, but I think the Australian Jewish community just appreciates the
Right.
support.
The United States has a special envoy on anti-Semitism that who is tasked with standing up, speaking out against anti-Semitism abroad. It's
Abroad. Hmm.
that envoy is part of the State Department. Um, Now I don't know if now that there is a new administration, whether that position will stay, and if so, whether it is already filled. But um, do you know anything about that, Robert? Robert, have you looked into that? Because
Uh,
that could become a voice of the
yeah, I
United
think so. That's
States.
Deborah Lipstadt. That was
That
Yeah, but
was Deborah Lipstadt
yeah, but
in the last administration.
right. But she's not retaining her post,
No,
to the
yeah, I
best
think
of
that
my
could.
knowledge. Yeah,
I did see a statement from uh, an office, I think, within the State Department, the Office of Religious Freedom or something. I did see that they did comment once. But yeah, certainly that's something we can look into because we've seen, I know the Israeli government, both the Prime Minister even and the Foreign Minister have commented on what's going on in Australia and how it's unacceptable. And these kind of statements really, especially from senior people like that, they do make the media here. They do put pressure on the government to act. So I think that is quite helpful. So that is something, yeah, we can certainly
okay.
follow up.
Let's bring this down to grassroots. Those of you who have influence at any level in the media need to start putting a spotlight on what the anti-Semitism in Australia so that that news will reach higher, and then the pressure from higher up in the United States will be put on Australia. Am I saying this correctly?
100%. Yeah.
Right. So you've actually given us something to do, which is kind of rare in in these interviews. But for example, when I see news of Australia, I can share it on social media and even say something like tell your senators or whatever. And I think that that could be something that public opinion could really work, is what you're saying for Australians.
100%. I mean, like everywhere in the world, Australia is very focused on what's happening in America right now. Everyone's very sensitive to preserving the Australian-American relationship. So if there was indications that people in leadership roles in America are concerned about what's going on, I think that would add another dimension and really assist with taking action here, especially because there's an election coming up. So,
And don't forget tourism, which is can be a very an economic uh, downturn in tourism to Australia could be also a very strong motivator to try and clean up Australia's act.
100%. We've heard from Jewish tourists from several places who have cancelled trips to Australia. There was a famous incident a few months ago where a Jewish tourist actually was in an anti-Semitic incident in the city of Perth in Australia. So this is bad publicity, and the warning from the Simon Wiesenthal Centre, the travel warning, I mean that affects Jewish people. People need to think twice about. I mean, certainly it's still safe to visit certain areas in Australia, but people need to think about, whether they need to cover signs of their being Jewish in other places. So it's a concern for tourism.
So, just to make it clear to our majority of American audience, when you see something about Australia, anti-Semitism, and you say, okay, that's Australia, I don't need to share it on social media, you need to share it on social media to help bring it to the attention to help the Jews in Australia. Would you agree with
100%.
that wrap up?
100%. I think that's a real concrete way that people could assist and help out is by raising awareness, because it's not, yeah, Australia's far away from many places, but we're very connected with the world. Everyone's on social media, everyone's watching what's going on, including people in leadership roles here. So I think the more people's talking about this, it's a real way you can make a difference.
Evelyn, do you want to share anything else?
No, no.
Okay, but I would highly, highly encourage our listeners when they see news, anti-Semitic news about Australia, to share it. So, you know how you can share on social media. Let's kind of start a grassroots campaign to help the Jewish community of Australia. I thank you, Robert, so much for coming on. I thank our listeners. For those of you who would like to know more about Evelyn and myself, you can go to YouTube. You can go to YouTube, Apple Podcasts and Spotify for Never Again Is Now podcast. And as we end every podcast, we say, please speak up against anti Semitism and all hate.